Hi, I'm John Bloom, and I'm a senior conversation designer for Google, focusing mostly on discovery of Google Assistant features. Today, I'd like to talk to you about a discovery tool that we internally call By the Way. My hope is that this will be valuable for designers of other digital assistants and also for designers of actions on Google. So, today, discoverability on digital assistants is an unsolved problem. Our VP of Engineering, Scott Huffman, said as much at CES last year. Now, he was focusing specifically on actions on Google and discovery of those. But you might find it interesting that internally, we find the same challenge with features of the Google Assistant. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. Just to be clear, when we talk about discoverability, we're talking about discoverability of features of the Google Assistant and actions on Google. What does it do? What are its features? When you take the Google Assistant in its form on the Google Home out of the box, its form factor doesn't give away what it can do. This is an issue for all software, but it's especially an issue for voice-only interfaces. Let's compare the Google Home to something with a graphic user interface or a graphic user interface only, like Google Docs. As you can see with Google Docs, there's many menus, and you can explore and click on those menus, and you can find features and learn what it does. So for example, you look under a menu and you see rename, and you realize that you can rename the document. Or you see download, and you realize that you can take this document out of the cloud and put it on your local device. That is not the case when you've got a voice-only interface. The problem gets a lot easier when you add a visual interface to the Google Assistant and other digital assistants. Now, certain pieces of information can be shared on the screen that tell you about what the assistant can do. But it's not a completely solved problem because the screen is often being used for other things. For example, on the phone, you might have another app open, or on a smart display, you might be using it as a picture frame when it's sitting there not being interacted with. So at times like that, the screen is not really there for discovery. But yes, it can be used sometimes for that purpose. So as a conversation designer, when facing an issue like this, I do what conversation designers often do and ask, well, how do people solve this problem? And can we solve it in a similar way? So we ask ourselves this question, not just with the Google Assistant, but with other products as well. So just to give an example, to put this in perspective, this is a picture of my friend Pete. Pete and I went to college together, and we met each other doing college radio. Now I should say, in this photo, he's holding a microphone to a camel's mouth. That's because he's a sound engineer, and he took the photo for that purpose, to make that point. But Pete and I shared an interest, which we learned we shared over time, in obscure movies, obscure music, a feeling we weren't the coolest kids on campus, things like that. But over time, we continue to grow as friends, and we continue to learn things about each other through many different channels. So, as an example, Pete recently sent me an email about a cheesy movie he saw when he was young that scared him very badly. And in the email, he sent me a link to a YouTube clip of the movie, and I learned more about my friend Pete's psyche through this interaction. And this is not unlike how we learn about digital assistants. We might get an email that tells us a little bit about what it can do. And so we've just learned a little bit more about our digital assistant through email. And there are other channels that we can use for discovery. For example, a card may appear on a smart display that tells us a little bit more about what our digital assistant can do. We might see buttons on the bottom of the screen if we're using the assistant on a mobile device, and that can tell us a little bit more about what the assistant can do in a way that's relevant to the activity that's going on right now. And in the human realm, this may be similar to if you're talking to someone, let's say it's Pete, and Pete is wearing a t-shirt that shows a band that he loves. And I say, hey, you like that band? I like that band. We know more about each other right now. Or you know somebody who's wearing a hat that is emblazoned with a corporate name, and you realize, oh, you work for that company? And you continue that conversation. It's similar to when Pete showed me a picture of him with a camel holding a microphone. If he posts that on social media, then people know, oh, he can do sound design, at least with a little more interaction. So these are all forms of discovery through different channels. But a really important channel that we haven't discussed so far is conversation. That's how people do it most. Cliff Nass, who used to be a professor at Stanford, made the point that conversation is the primary form of human communication. And there's really no reason it should be any different with digital assistants. Finding out about each other in real time through text or voice is what people do. And this is the medium in which we are most comfortable. As a coworker of mine, Tanya Kralchik, put it, the digital assistant should be an expert in itself. While it's okay to send out emails, and it's okay to find things on the screen like buttons, there's no reason why we shouldn't rely on the digital assistant, like the Google Assistant, to communicate what it can and can't do through voice or some other form of real-time communication. This is very, very natural for people to do. In conversation, people are always finding things they have in common with each other, common ground. It might be that we share the same language. It might be that we share a similar background. We grew up in the same town. It might be a shared environment. And as we build up this common ground, it facilitates our conversations going forward. We can start referring to things that we both mutually know we understand. So for example, I find out that Pete likes a certain band and I like that band too. We can refer to that band without any further explanation of who they are, where they're from, what kind of music they play, etc. We can just refer to that band. And conversation gets facilitated over time through common ground. And that process of building up common ground is called, no surprise, grounding. And the process of grounding, although shaky at times, is a very efficient way for us to figure out what we know about each other. So, with a digital assistant, it doesn't have to be any different. From the moment we start talking to our digital assistant, it's an opportunity to learn. With the Google Assistant today, specifically on the Google Home, if you plug in the device, after some time of getting set up, it will introduce itself and it'll mention some features of what it can do and also how to trigger it by saying the wake word, which I don't want to say right now in case you have a device in the room. But the first impression is very important, and this is a great time to get some discovery underway. And then there are other times as well. So a very natural thing for people to do with digital assistants when they first get them is to say, what can you do? I've seen this elsewhere and I've seen it at Google, where people ask this without us even promoting it as a feature. That's a great time to start showing things that it can do, like linked services and weather and media, etc. And you can keep updating that and keeping it fresh so that every time they happen to ask that, if they happen to ask it again, there's more information for them. Another interesting time to provide information about features is when people don't know what to say. So somebody triggers their device and then they're silent because they're a little perplexed. After a few seconds, then we can pop up recommendations either on the screen or in some cases, maybe by voice as well. So this is a very natural way and a very conversational based way of communicating discovery opportunities. And now we get to by the way. So another way that we can tell people about something that may be relevant to them and beneficial is after they've asked for some sort of information or they've asked the assistant to do something, we bring up something that may seem initially peripheral but might be of value to them at that moment. So the example you see here, the person says, how's my commute? And the assistant comes back and says, the best way to get to work by car is, etc., etc. By the way, if you'd ever like to hear a summary of your day, just say, good morning. So this is an extremely robust tool we've seen. People do notice it, and they do take us up on it, and they find value in it when it's used properly. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what we mean by that. So the fact that it's robust is important because it's robust in the sense that it can be used to bring a lot of people to these new features, but at the same time, if used incorrectly, it can be a major problem. So it's almost like TNT. With TNT, you can build roads, you can make tunnels, you can create new pathways between people. But if used improperly, you can also blow yourself up. So it's very important to be careful with by the way. So first, we should define what by the way is. And by the way is an offering beyond a user's request. The offering's relevant, interesting, and or useful to the user given their request and maybe other signals as well. We should also point out that there's more than one kind of by the way. It can be used for several different purposes. These are probably the two most common. One is general information about the world. So somebody asks about Lucinda Williams' discography, and we can come back and say first the discography, but then also say, and by the way, it's her birthday, or something else that is relevant at that point about Lucinda Williams or something else about the user's query. But then the other way it can be used is to teach the user about other features of the Google Assistant. And we'll be focusing more on that second one right now. Now, the reason why I said it's robust and risky has a lot to do with the channel that it's on. So the audio channel has some characteristics that make it quite different from visual interfaces. So with the visual modality, you can present a lot of information at the same time. So let's say a website. You can have multiple pieces of information on the screen in a website because the visual field is massively parallel. Meanwhile, with the audio channel, that is not the case. With the audio channel, it is completely serial. There is only one piece of information being presented at any given time. It is a very narrow channel, and that channel is mandatory. When it's going, you have to hear it. So, that is very important. When you're playing a by the way, that time could be better spent, if you're using it wrong, with silence, which the user may find important at that time, if they're done with their task. Or it could be providing other information that is relevant to the user at that moment based on their request. So one must be careful with it because it's in the audio channel, which is this narrow channel that is serial and mandatory. Now we should talk a little bit for a moment about that relevance thing from earlier. Years ago, Paul Grice, a philosopher, posited that there are 4 maxims that people use when generating speech in a conversation and comprehending speech in a conversation. Those are quality, quantity, relevance, and manner. To describe them in brief, quality means always tell the truth. Quantity means say as much as is needed, no more, no less. Relevance is self-evident. It means be relevant. And manner means produce your speech in a way that is understandable to the user, or I should say the addressee in this case. But what's interesting is researchers years later, Sperber and Wilson, found that of these, relevance is really the coin of the realm, and that the other 3 are manifestations of relevance. And so what we mean by maxims is that, yes, people aren't always truthful. They aren't always saying just as much as is needed. But the assumption of those maxims is always there. And that's how we learn to understand what people mean when they say it. Even if it's not slightly relevant or not slightly truthful, we can interpret it through that lens. So let me give some examples to make this clearer. Somebody asks, how much longer will you be? And the person comes back and says 3 minutes. We can say that person, we assume they're being truthful. We assume they're saying just as much as is needed. And we assume they're being relevant. And it seems pretty clear looking at this that that is relevant, right? She asked a question and he gave a time increment, which seems like a very, very appropriate answer to that question. But he might not have said that. She might have said, how much longer will you be? And he could have said, fix yourself a snack. On its surface, at a very literal level, that answer is not relevant. it doesn't seem to be an answer to the question of how long. There's no time increment or anything. But because the speaker who said, how much time will you be, is assuming the maximum of relevance, they will try and process that further and figure out what the speaker meant when they said, fix yourself a snack. So that's very important when we're thinking about, by the way, is it relevant? And we never want to break the maximum of relevance. So you would never hear somebody respond to how much longer will you be with whales eat plankton. That isn't just stretching the maxim, that is completely breaking the maxim, and we just don't do it in conversation unless there's something really, really wrong. And this is what we need to take away when we're talking about, by the way. So, somebody says to the assistant, play jazz, and the assistant comes back, hopefully it doesn't do this. Sure, here's a Google Play music station called Find Romance. And by the way, you can always say, find my phone. This would not be appreciated by a user because Find My Phone has nothing to do, as at least on its surface, with asking to hear music. So this is something we want to avoid. It is breaking the maximum of relevance. But if they asked to hear jazz and we came back with a playlist and then said, and by the way, you can always say next track, this might be valuable information to them at that time, given what they're trying to do. And we've seen this in research. We've found that when we make a very close link between the triggering query, like play jazz, and the by the way that is triggered, like next track, if those two things are extremely related to each other, people will take us up on it. But if we do this more broadly, and we mention something like next track for any weather or alarm query that the user might bring forward, we don't get the same response. And we're running the risk of customer satisfaction being compromised in doing that. So, when we mention something like setting the volume, we've seen that the response to setting the volume is welcome if they're doing something with media. But if they're doing something else, then it's not as welcome. And it should be pointed out that relevance doesn't always have to do with the triggering query. There might be other ways that this information is relevant or important to the user. It might be, for example, time of day. If the person asks for something in the morning, that might be a good time to tell them about the good morning routine, which tells them about their upcoming day. So sometimes, not always, we can use the time of day as something that can tell us that this is an important thing and a time to surface the by the way. In addition to relevance, you want to also make sure that you don't do this too often, that you're doing it just enough that the person's going to appreciate it, no more, no less. So let's say it's something like teaching the person about the next track. They can always say, hey, next track. How often do you want to do that? Just once? Maybe just once is the way to go. You just tell them about it and leave it at that. Or do you want to do it once a month until they actually try it and then you stop? What about after they try it? Maybe they try it and then they don't use it again for months. Do you mention it again? These are important questions you need to ask yourself before you put a by the way phrase in there. But in addition, you have to ask yourself, how often should they hear all the by the ways? How does this environment of by the ways work together? You might have more than one that you could be surfacing at any given time. And you have to ask yourself, how do those play together nicely so that the person isn't getting overwhelmed? Do you max out at one by the way a week, a day, a month? And should it be amount of time or should it be number of interactions? So they hear it every 100 interactions, every 20 interactions. You have to make a decision about that. And I'll say this, even though I can't give specifics about how Google does it, I can say that consider what you think is a reasonable number of times that a person should hear a by the way, and then cut that in half. Because the potential for a compromised customer experience is high with these, as we've already mentioned. So you want to be very, very conservative in how you use this. Now, in addition to how relevant it is, and also the cadence with which you're going to present them, you also have to be sure that the wording of the by the way is something that's going to be appreciated by the user. So, by the way, we don't always say by the way when we want to do something like that. In addition, we use other phrases. We might say side note, or we might say something like also, or speaking of which. So you probably want to mix it up so it doesn't start sounding very salient and very robotic over time, that it doesn't always say by the way. Sometimes you might have to add a value proposition for the thing that you're promoting if it's not self-evident. Something like next track might be so obvious you don't need to mention what its value is. But for something like a good morning routine on the Google Assistant, it's something where we might have to say to hear about your upcoming day, because good morning in and of itself doesn't explain what it does. So these are important things to consider when you're wording your by the ways. And if you're going to make that an automatic process, how is that going to be automatic? This is not quite as critical in terms of relevance and cadence, and the wording in general. But one thing we've seen come up a bit is that you need to be careful about whether you come across as punitive in your wording. You don't want to come across as punitive. Don't say things like, next time try this, or you could have said. The way the person said it is always right. We just need to figure out a way to tell them in a nice way that they might have been able to say something else, if that's what you're trying to do with your by the way. So another phrasing could be something like, and by the way, you can also say, and do sort of a yes and approach. Finally, when you've implemented your by the way, you have to ask yourself, how are we going to make sure this is doing what it's supposed to do? In other words, are people taking you up on this feature that you've promoted? But also, are you not compromising customer satisfaction by doing it? If anything, hopefully you're increasing and improving the user experience because you're providing relevant information. So it's really important that you're tracking, do people actually take you up on the offer that is being promoted? And also, are people not being upset by this thing? And actually, are they having a better experience because of it? You want to track both of those. And it's not just that people take you up on your offer. Do they take you up on that offer more than once? Because if you mention it, they try it and they say, oh, that was fantastic, but then they never use it again. Maybe it wasn't that valuable to them. So there's taking you up on the offer, but there's also retention of that feature, that they've actually said, this is worthwhile to me more than once. So these are things that are important to track as you go. So once again, by the way, is a really robust feature that can be a great discovery tool, but at the same time, it can be very risky because of the audio channel and the nature of the audio channel. So it's very explosive, so you want to be careful with it and use it to its best effect and only use it when necessary. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you appreciated this talk. I'm John Bloom. You can reach me at Talk2Machines. And I also highly recommend you check out Google's resources online for conversation design, which can be found at actions.google.com/design. Thank you very much. Take care.